Now that we've seen how to properly prepare the key blank for impressioning, let's take a look at the construction of a wafer or disc tumbler lock and the type of marks that this type of lock will give during the impressioning process. This is a pretty typical 5-wafer tumbler cam lock. These locks are very inexpensive and very common. They make an ideal place to begin your study of impressioning. There is no key in the lock at this time, and all 5 of the wafer tumblers are pushed as far up as they will go by their individual springs. Watch as we insert a key blank into the lock. Notice that all of the wafers go down in turn as the key is inserted into the lock, and now they protrude from the bottom of the lock. But they don't protrude evenly. Let's look at it again. The distance that the tumbler protrudes from the bottom of the lock is exactly the distance of the cut that needs to be on that key in order to operate the lock. Here we see the correct key inserted into the lock, and you can see that all 5 of the wafer tumblers are flush with both the top and the bottom surfaces of the plug. Here we have 2 of the wafer tumblers out of our lock. This one corresponds to a number 1 cut, which is no cut at all on the key. This one corresponds to a number 5 cut, which is the deepest possible cut on this particular lock. The key passes through this opening in the center of each of the tumblers. The blade of the key will make contact with the tumbler at this point. This is the only point that the tumbler touches the blade of the key. This is where we will get our marks. Notice the difference between this portion of the 2 tumblers. The difference in thickness corresponds exactly to the difference in the depth of the 2 different cuts. To better illustrate what goes on inside the lock during the impressioning process, we'll use this cutaway diagram of a typical wafer tumbler cam lock. This is the outer housing or shell of the lock. This is the core of the lock, which rotates when the key is turned. This is our tumbler, which once again is a number 5 depth. And this is the spring, which lifts the tumbler all the way to the up position when there is no key in the lock. When the key is inserted into the lock, it passes through this opening, making contact with the lower edge of the opening, pushing the tumbler down against the pressure of the spring until it reaches a point that will allow the core to turn. Either end of the tumbler extending into the slots in the lock housing will prevent the lock from turning. When the correct key is inserted into the lock, the tumbler will align with the top and bottom of the core, allowing the lock to turn. When a key blank is inserted into the lock, the tumbler will be pushed down as far as it can go. This is the condition we'll start in when we begin impressioning. The secret of impressioning is to bind the tumbler against the side of the slot in the housing, preventing the tumbler from moving. Then bump the key against the tumbler while it is bound in place. This pressure of the key hitting against the tumbler while it is in a bound condition is what leaves the mark on the key. In our diagram, the red color is used to indicate where the tumbler is binding. Notice that it binds not only against the lock housing, but against the core also. This holds the tumbler rigidly in place while we press downward on the key blank. This pressure of the key blank against the tumbler is what leaves the impressioning mark. Once we have pressed downward on the key once, though, the tumbler will move slightly, so it will no longer leave a mark. So you must release the tension on the lock between each bump. There are 3 steps involved in impressioning. Number 1, twist the key blank to bind the tumbler in the lock. 2, bump the key to make the mark on the key. 3, release the tension on the lock. These 3 steps, repeated over and over again, are the heart of impressioning. Looking very closely at just the blade of the key where it contacts the tumbler, we see how the twisting force and the downward pressure of bumping the key in the lock work together to leave the mark on the key. This only happens if the tumbler is bound in place. If the tumbler is at the correct height to allow the lock to turn, it will not bind and it will not leave a mark on the key. That is how you know when to stop filing. When the lock does not leave a mark, then you have reached the correct position in that particular cut. However, if you file your cut too deep, the tumbler will bind once again at the top edge this time and will continue to give you a mark until you have cut your key blank in half. This is why it is very important to go slowly. If you pass the correct point, you will once again get marks and ruin your key. One of the biggest problems in impressioning a wafer tumbler lock is keeping the key straight in the lock. As you bump the key, you need to make sure that you don't twist the key up and down in relation to the center line of the lock. You can force tumblers that would not normally be binding into a binding position. This is one of the reasons why an impressioning tool is so handy. Let's put all of our basics together now and see how the key moves in the lock. Remember the 3 steps: twist, bump, release. Twist, bump, and release. Do this over and over again until you feel like you have marks on the key. Then remove the key. An alternate method that is especially effective on wafer tumbler locks is the figure 8 method. Insert the key and twist and bump at the same time in a figure 8 motion. Just make sure that you release the tension on the lock between bumps. Putting the key into the lock and simply wiggling it from side to side is no way to impression. You may get some marks this way, but not nearly the marks that you will get by twisting, binding, and then bumping. Now that we know how to bump the key in the lock and we know how bumping works, let's take a look at the different kinds of marks that you will get on the key from wafer tumbler locks. Here's a key that has been bumped in our wafer tumbler cam lock. The marks you'll see on this key are pretty typical. Watch how they change as the light changes. Because the portion of the tumbler that is in contact with the key blank is basically rectangular, you can expect to have rectangular marks on the key. Most of the marks will be a rectangular line going across the blade of the key. Often, because of the way the key is bumped in the lock, one edge or the other of the tumbler will bite into the key somewhat harder than the other. So it's not unusual to have marks that are stronger on one side of the blank than they are on the other. Also, as the key is moved up and down, sometimes the edges of the tumbler bite into the key blade harder than the rest of the blade. So many times you will have 2 marks side by side, which are made by the 2 edges of the tumbler.